Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I'm Richard and this is Lap of the World. I returned to you after a week or so's hiatus for a much needed vacation. But now that we are back, we're getting straight back to work. In this case, we are jumping right in, exchanging the stock catalytic converters on my 2004 Gallardo for some Larini high flow cats. Now I'm doing this in the continued quest to have the Lamborghini positioned, my Gallardo positioned, as a viable backup car so as to not have a repeat of this spring wherein I had one car down for extended maintenance that was then protracted by part shortages or availability issues, and the other car, this one, not quite yet ready at that time for track use. The NSX is It is done and ready. I just need to sign up for an event at this point. More on that soon. But for today, we're getting stuck in on the Gallardo. Now, as far as replacing the catalytic converters, I'm not really doing this for necessarily the performance increase, although there will be one, nor am I doing it for the happy noises. Although I'm sure there will be a slight increase in volume as well. No, rather I'm doing it because I went on the internet and I found this.
The only reason we have problems with your 5 litres is because the cats. I tell everybody, if you go and buy a 5 litre, the first thing to do is to take the cats out, the original cats.
That sage piece of advice is an excerpt from a longer video by RE Performance UK, who you might call experts on the subject of these early 5-liter V10s, as well as their 5.2-liter cousins that came in the later Gallardos, Huracans, and R8s. Now the TLDW there is that the stock catalytic converters have a propensity to disintegrate with age, and the ceramic particulate that is a result of that disintegration, because of the way the exhaust pulses are in this particular car, can get sucked back into the cylinders, get processed around by the pistons moving around, and score the cylinder walls, leading to a litany of problems. And basically needing to have the engine rebuilt, which is not a proposition that I really would be looking forward to. But I've left links to that video as well as a more recent video done by my internet friend JM on Cars, who also went and had a similar thing done to his super cheap Gallardo that he purchased earlier this year, and also, got advised to replace the stock catalytic converters on that car as well. I'm going to do it myself though and walk you through the process in case you too have an early Gallardo and want to take care of this on your own dime. I will say that the work involved is not that bad, and then the catalytic converters themselves, the Larini items that I'm going back with, I went with these. They were A, recommended by RE Performance in that video, B, they were available, and C, I had an onshore in the United States distributor that I could work through, and that was Jason Burtman of Burtman Industries. So if you want some, I'll leave a link to his shop in the description as well. None of this is sponsored, for the record. I'm just letting you know where I found this information and who I went through with the experiences I had. But with all of that said, let's go and diffuse these time bombs so we can move on to driving the car more. Before we can put our new fancy high flow cats on, of course, the first step is to remove the old catalytic converters. To do that, it's going to take a few steps here, but none of them are terribly difficult. If you have some basic mechanical knowledge and the appropriate tools, you should be able to accomplish this in decent order. The first step is to remove the 2 side trim panels and this rear trim panel. Now, my side trim panels were already off because I was changing the fuel filters, but having removed those panels, now you have access to the air box. The air box is the next thing that needs to come off, so let's walk through that. First, loosen the hose clamps on your throttle body hoses and your PCV hose. Next, loosen the 4 screws on each cover and remove the covers and filters. Next, on each side, you're going to want to remove these 2 10mm bolts that hold this wiring harness bracket in place, because you need to move the bracket out of the way to get to the 2 bolts on each side holding the air box in place. With the harness now loose, you should be able to move it to get to these 2 bolts on either side, as well as one more hiding down on the front side of the air box. Significantly loosen off the hose clamps holding the air box to the little intake hoses on the side. I found it easier to just undo mine entirely and remove the hose clamps for the moment. Don't forget to also bag and tag all of your hardware. There's not a whole lot to keep track of with this job, but better safe than sorry. Now, the last and most difficult thing you'll need to do is loosen a hose clamp that holds a small hose onto your smog pump. You can probably see it down there, the little screw and clamp. I'll circle it on my screen. You'll need a long screwdriver and a good bit of patience. With that hose clamp loose, we can now begin the process of actually removing the air box. Be particularly careful with the paint on your side panels up here, as this the air box with its little intake ends over here is nearly as wide as your opening. If you don't feel comfortable working in that tight of a space, I would advise probably taping, putting some tape or maybe draping a towel or service mat or something down there just to prevent any accidental nicks. So with some patience and some tactical relocation of various wiring harnesses and things like that, we've been able to pull our air box forward, or I guess rearward a little bit. I say forward as it's towards me, but towards the back of the car. So we are now more or less up against our oil fill cap, or oil fill, whatever you call that, spout. We have sort of moved these wiring harnesses strategically around under here, tucked them in. The last thing we need to do, I did at some point reach down in front of this bar and was able to tug on the hose and pull it off of the smog pump. There's also, you can see down in here, there is one wiring plug we need to undo, and you do undo that from the back. It's kind of a blind grab, but yeah, it's like any other wire connector. You kind of pinch on it and pull, and that will come loose. And that should be our last obstacle to removing the air box. With the airbox out of the way, you can now see we have more or less unfettered access to our two catalytic converters here. So the next things we need to do is get those loose, which will involve undoing these clamps. So what I would recommend at this point is grab a can of your penetrating lube of choice and give these things a liberal dousing. Now, go have a beverage of your preference, put down the tools and call it a day, check out some more Lap of the World videos, and come back tomorrow once the stuff has had a chance to work its magic. And now, having let these oft-cantankerous bolts marinate overnight, grab yourself a 13mm socket, a big-ish wrench, gird thy loins, cross thy fingers, and give 'em hell. If you're lucky, or if you, like me, have recently disassembled and reassembled the exhaust yourself, then you might not end up with too much of a fight on your hands. If you are unlucky, it is well known to strip or break these studs or clamps. If you do that in the course of disassembly, as long as the inner ring is intact, I hear that V-band clamps are a viable alternative to these very expensive factory bracket style clamps. While you're in the area, now is also a good time to grab a 10mm wrench. A flare nut wrench is ideal, but again, I've had these off recently, so I don't expect them to be that stubborn. But you also need to undo this little fitting, which is holding in a heated wire temperature probe. So let's see if we can undo this gracefully. Once it's loose, this can take a little bit of jiggling or wiggling, but it should pull out fairly easily. I mean, careful not to like bend the tip. There we go. Before we put the car in the air, there's one more thing we'll want to take care of, at least on the right side of the car, and that is undoing this little fitting here for the lovingly dubbed misfire tube. It is actually an air injection tube as part of the emissions system, but it has been dubbed such because the original parts had a propensity to clog and causing, as you might expect, some misfires. There is an updated part number that uses a stainless steel tube instead of a mild steel equivalent, which I think mine may be the updated part. Although I'm not sure. I don't think I've been able to trace it back to any of the other issues that I had had previously with the car that I think I have now resolved. So I will leave them alone for the moment. But you will need a 10mm, ideally a flare nut wrench, because this is kind of like a brake fitting almost. But you'll undo that little nut, and again, it should just sort of pull away from the cat. The left side misfire tube is not quite as easy to get to, but it can be done from the top. I was bracing myself or balancing myself on top of the oil tank or this cross member, and then reaching underneath with my wrench, and was able to get some pretty decent traction and leverage, and even a decent range of motion on the wrench from that angle. So with everything now disconnected on the rearward side of each cat, it is now time to move on to the next step, which involves raising the rear of the car and removing the rear wheels. With the car in the air and the wheel removed, you should be able to look into the wheel well underneath some of the heat shielding and find the forward exhaust clamps as well as the upstream O2 sensors. Again, all of these things tend to fight you. You can use some penetrating lube on the exhaust clamps. Obviously, don't use any on the O2 sensor if you plan to reuse the sensor. Although if you're doing this and you haven't changed your O2 sensors in a while, now is probably a good time as any. A note with the O2 sensors, you do have the option of just disconnecting them at the, or disconnecting their wiring connectors and just removing the old O2 sensors with the cat. With all clamps, wires, and tubes now disconnected from it, we are ready to actually remove the catalytic converter from the car. It does come out the top of the car where we removed the air box with a little bit of clever manipulation. Removing the right-hand cat is unfortunately the easy part. If you just look in the back of your car, you'll note that when it's disconnected, you can just pluck the right-hand cat straight out of the car. The left-hand cat is kind of wedged in by several other items that take a little bit more doing to remove. I think the common approach to this is just to remove the rear bumper and then remove the exhaust and then pull the cats off. And in full disclosure, that's how I did this the last time, because at the same time I was also changing out the tailpipe. Not changing out the tailpipe this time, and knowing that the rear bumper covers on these cars are kind of notoriously fragile, I wanted to see if I can get around that, and I have. So what you're going to see, or see kind of explained, I guess I would call it, because I was trying to kind of experiment as I was going here as far as a good way to do this, because as usual, the service manual is complete trash in that regard. But yeah, I have managed to do this without removing the bumper, although it does get a little bit fiddly. So I'm going to explain this as best I can and walk through the process. Here we go. So first, I want you to know that we still do have the rear cover in place. The rear bumper cover is in place, and the tailpipe is still in place underneath this. What we have done is take loose but not remove this cross member here. This is kind of a frame rail section. I guess it's mainly used for stiffening. I at least was able to get that much out of the shop manual, that nothing was going to fall apart if I removed it. But there are 3 points or 4 points on the back of this where you have some wiring harnesses that are kind of zip tied to it. You can just clip those zip ties because the little holder clips just have slots, so you can replace the zip ties. Next, you have to go over to the wheel wells and remove the fender liners so you can get to this fastener and this fastener. On the left side of the car, I was able to only remove the rear fender liner, as there was a little cutout for the fastener over here on the front fender liner. Now, with the 4 what I'll call outside bolts removed, you can come back up top and remove 4 more bolts on either side. There's 1 here, and then 3 up around the joint with the other frame rail there. Again, same number on the opposite side, 1 here, 3 up here. And then you also need to remove these 2 that connect to the oil tank. Once you have all that loose, again, be extremely careful, because this, whereas I discussed the air box nearly being as wide as your opening, this is actually wider than your opening, near as I can tell. So you're going to need to exercise a lot of caution tilting this. But yeah, you can wiggle it up to get it clear of the oil tank, pull it forward a little bit or pull it rearward a little bit towards you, and then tilt it up and kind of slide it back down. And that should give you the angle you need to access the left-hand cat without removing the bumper. A couple of other notes on manipulating the cross member: you will need to kind of unclip the gas door emergency pull. I also found it useful to push the intake air ducts back out into the wheel wells a little bit, as otherwise they will kind of get in the way of the top of this thing moving around. With the cross member now loose and tilted, we should have the clearance we need to remove the old cat. Just to explain the manipulations that I did real quick, I was able to kind of tilt the back end of it up and get it clear of the tailpipe flange, then pull it forward a little bit. Then I had to rotate it 180 degrees, basically turn it upside down, and then I was able to sort of smoosh it out up here. You know, with the oil tank disconnected from the cross member, it has a little bit of wiggle to it, but do not force it against the oil tank, because the oil tank is still fastened in from a couple of different places, and the last thing I would want to do is put stress on the fittings on that as well. So having both of these old things off the car, let's give them a little bit of inspection. I'm told one way that you can tell about a failure is if you kind of shake them a little bit and see if you end up with any particulate in your hand. I don't think I saw anything there. Let's check the other side. I don't see anything, but I don't know if you heard that. Take a listen. Yeah, I don't think the cores on these are supposed to be loose. So based on that, I'm going to say we've probably dodged a bullet here. Just for comparison, take one of the new ones here, and I can give it a pretty good shake. And there's certainly nothing loose in there. You can see the core down in there. That may or may not be in focus, but that's apparently an HJC or HJC as the British would call it core. So should be good to go. These are also much smaller, so I'm anticipating the task of putting them back will be a little bit easier. But yeah, it looks like we've dodged a bullet. So let's go ahead and get the new ones in the car. A quick word on the exhaust clamps as far as how they go back together. Often I found that they don't come apart that gracefully, and it may not be intuitive how they're supposed to go back together, so here you go. You have this, what I'll call the donut, and this actually goes inside these flanges here. I'm using the two old cats to demonstrate, and that's what actually does the sealing. So once those are kind of smushed together, that will form the seal, and then the way they are smushed together is with the clamp, and it's got this groove on the inside that corresponds to the pointy bits of the flanges. You just separate the clamp. You do typically have to kind of do a little bit of smushing by hand, but once you're at a certain point, then you put the clamp together over the top, and the V groove in the clamp will tighten down on that donut as these fasteners are tightened. You don't need to tighten these super tight, as that can have unfortunate results. But you do want to make sure that they are somewhat snug and you're not able to manipulate, you shouldn't be able to wiggle the pipes on either side. Having struggled with the one stud, I decided to take the opportunity before reassembly to chase all of the threads on the clamp fasteners just to make sure that I didn't have any additional issues during reassembly. Beginning reassembly, I went ahead and pre-installed the O2 sensors in the new cats. I also unbagged and made sure I had accounted for all of my clamp hardware. I'm not going to cover reinstallation in any great detail as it's mostly the reverse of disassembly. The one thing I will say though is that I did find it easiest to loosely install the rear side clamp first, and then loosely enough where you can still kind of wiggle the cat around, and then because you're then working from underneath the car, go up and put the front clamps in place at that point, and then tighten everything down once the front clamps are in position. Having gotten as far as getting the air box back on, there is one more reassembly note that I wanted to touch on, and that is getting the hose clamp and the hose back on your smog pump down here. This is not particularly complicated, but it is what I would call fiddly. I found the best way of doing this is to kind of grab the clamp, and you could probably accomplish this maybe easier with a spring clamp that you could hold with some pliers from the top and then stick the hose on and then just release. I don't know, I have a spring clamp. I may try that if this doesn't work first time. But what I like to do is stick my hand down in here. This hand, I can kind of jam it down in here and just sort of, use this grip to hold the clamp in place while I push the hose through it and onto the barb on the smog pump, at which point I can kind of move my top finger and hopefully get a screwdriver positioned to snug it up enough to where I can continue tightening it without needing my hand in there anymore. But yeah, I think there are probably a lot of people that just like delete this thing for the weight savings. It's crossed my mind, but I just haven't gotten there yet, so this is what I'm left working with. Wrapping up reassembly, I did have one last small detail that I wanted to take care of, and that involved these little fasteners on the airbox covers. They are a little bit different than what I started with. So this was one of the 8 original fasteners that came on these things, or at least how the car came to me. I'm not sure if they're original, but I have to assume so. They're of all things a flathead. They're an M6 by 1 by 30 millimeter if you're curious or if you want to order some. But yeah, I get the Lamborghini agricultural, tractor roots, but flathead screws, in my humble opinion, have absolutely no place on a modern supercar, especially something that's going to have to be, that you would expect to have to do and undo several times in your ownership. So forget that. In their place, I have swapped in some button head cap screws that just use like a 4 millimeter hex. So that means when I go to take them off, I'm not having to worry about having the blade centered to be quick about it. I can just jam a T-handle or a nut driver in there and whip them right off the car. So, small detail, but again, now I'm sure there's some designer out there that's now saying, but Richard, my aesthetic. Well, as somebody who actually has to touch these fasteners, here is my response to you. Well, if you've made it this far, you have earned the payoff that will be the first cold start of this Gallardo with its new Larini Clubsport cats. If you found the video useful, or if you've just enjoyed watching, don't forget to subscribe. But until next time, I'm Richard, this is Lap of the World, and I will see you all in the next video, if not at the track.